Tony Russo was standing alone in his closed auto shop when everything finally sank in. The lights were off, but rain still found its way through a small crack in the roof, dripping steadily onto the concrete floor, each drop echoing louder than the last. His toolbox sat in the corner, exactly where it had been for years, except now there was a white envelope taped to it. A termination letter. No warning. No explanation. Just a few cold sentences telling him he was done. Fired. After 22 years of showing up early, staying late, and fixing cars like they belonged to his own family. Tony stared at the paper, his chest tight, his hands shaking slightly, thinking about the moment that led here. One decision, one act of help, and the question that wouldn't leave him alone. How could helping someone nearly cost him everything? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 6 months earlier, Tony's life was painfully ordinary in the best way. He lived in a modest house outside Cleveland, drove the same pickup he'd owned for over a decade, and spent most evenings eating dinner alone at his kitchen table, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. His wife, Laura, had passed away 3 years before after a short illness, and since then, routine was how Tony survived. Wake up at 5. Coffee black. Open the shop by 6. Fix what's broken. Keep your head down. That was the deal he made with life. At Russo Auto, customers trusted him because he never talked down to them, never added repairs they didn't need. If it can wait, I'll tell you, he'd say. If it's unsafe, I won't let you drive away. That reputation mattered to him. It was the last thing that felt solid in a world that had already taken too much. One Tuesday afternoon, just before closing, a beat-up blue sedan limped into the parking lot. The engine coughed like it was fighting for air. A woman stepped out, maybe early 40s, tired eyes, hair pulled back like she hadn't had time to think about it. Her name was Melissa Carter. She explained, quietly embarrassed, that the car had been stalling on her way home from work. Tony popped the hood, listened for less than a minute, and knew what it was. A failing fuel pump. It wasn't cheap. When he told her the estimate, Melissa swallowed hard and looked down at the cracked pavement. I don't get paid until next Friday, she said. I just need it to last a little longer. I have 2 kids. I can't miss work. Tony felt that familiar pull in his chest, the one that reminded him of Laura's voice saying, do the right thing, even when no one's watching. Tony could have sent her away. Shop policy was clear. No temporary fixes, no unpaid work, no exceptions. Instead, he did something small that would later be called a serious violation. He adjusted the system just enough to keep the car running safely for a short time. This isn't a real fix, he told her. You'll need to come back. But it should get you through the week. Melissa's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. Thank you, she said. You have no idea what this means. Tony waved it off, embarrassed by gratitude. He didn't charge her a cent. That night, as he locked up, he felt lighter than he had in a long time. If you've ever helped someone when you didn't have to, you know that feeling. But ask yourself this. Would you still do it if you knew what it might cost you? What Tony didn't know was that Russo Auto had been bought out by a regional chain months earlier. New ownership, new rules, cameras installed quietly, audits done remotely, every action logged, every minute tracked. When Melissa's car came back the following week, she paid in full, hugged Tony, and left smiling. Tony thought that was the end of it. 2 weeks later, his manager called him into the office. The room smelled like stale coffee and printer ink. A laptop sat open on the desk. On the screen was footage of Tony working on the sedan, time-stamped, zoomed in. You performed unauthorized labor, the manager said flatly. You exposed the company to liability. Tony tried to explain. He talked about safety, about compassion, about doing what he'd always done. The manager didn't argue. He just slid the letter across the desk. Terminated effective immediately. No severance. No appeal. The weeks that followed were heavy. Tony stopped opening the shop because it wasn't his anymore. He sat at home, listening to the rain, replaying the moment over and over. Maybe he should have followed the rules. Maybe kindness was a luxury he couldn't afford. Then, one morning, there was a knock at his door. Melissa stood there, holding a small envelope and looking nervous. She had heard what happened through a former coworker. Inside the envelope was cash. More than Tony had ever expected. I told my story online, she said. People listened. They helped. She paused. I wouldn't have made it without you. Tony didn't know what to say. His hands trembled as he closed the door and leaned against it, tears finally coming. A year later, Tony runs a small independent garage again. It's nothing fancy. The roof still leaks when it rains. but the sign has his name on it. On the wall behind the counter is a handwritten note from Melissa's kids that says, "Thank you for helping our mom." Tony reads it on hard days. And maybe that's the real question this story leaves us with. If you were standing in his place, staring at that car, hearing that quiet plea, what would you have done? And if helping someone cost you everything you thought was secure, would you still believe it was worth it? What you're about to hear is not just a story about losing a job. It is a story about injustice carried out quietly, behind paperwork and policies that were never meant to protect people like Tony Russo. It is about silence, the kind that follows when someone is pushed aside and told their voice no longer matters. And it is about a reckoning that arrived slowly, deliberately, and in a way no one inside that company saw coming. Because what happened to Tony did not stay inside the walls of a closed auto shop. It moved outward, into places that made people uncomfortable. It reached desks where authority sat. It reached ears that were trained to listen when something felt wrong. And once it did, there was no pulling it back. In the days after Tony was fired, the company expected the usual outcome. A middle-aged mechanic, recently widowed, no legal team, no public platform. Someone who would grieve quietly, maybe complain to a few friends, then disappear. That was the assumption. Silence was not just expected, it was calculated. Tony did exactly what they thought he would. He went home. He stopped calling. He didn't post online. He didn't threaten lawsuits. He simply existed in the quiet, trying to understand how 22 years could end in a single afternoon. If you were in his position, would you have fought back, or would you have done the same thing and gone quiet? But silence has a strange way of attracting attention when it doesn't break. And Tony didn't know that someone else had been watching long before his termination letter ever touched his toolbox. He didn't know that his name had already been written down, flagged not as a problem, but as a reference point. Months before he was fired, a routine compliance review had been triggered after a customer complaint at a different branch of the same company. That complaint had nothing to do with Tony. But during the review, patterns started to emerge. Employee turnover, rigid enforcement of policy, a rise in safety-related customer reports. And buried inside that data was something unexpected. Repeated customer praise for one mechanic who made them feel safe, who did the right thing, who refused to let them drive away in danger. Tony Russo. When Tony was terminated, it didn't register to him as anything more than bad luck. But inside the system, it landed differently. Because now there was a contradiction. A man consistently praised for safety was being removed for a safety-related decision. That contradiction was logged. Quietly. No one called Tony. No one warned him. But his file didn't disappear the way the company assumed it would. It moved. From internal review to an external consultant. From there, to a regulatory desk that handled labor practices and consumer safety complaints. This is where police involvement begins to enter the picture, not in flashing lights, but in paperwork, interviews, and sworn statements. Meanwhile, Tony was selling his wife's old jewelry to pay bills. He was skipping meals without realizing it. He was replaying that afternoon with Melissa again and again, asking himself if kindness had finally caught up with him. And here's the part that matters. He still believed he had done the right thing. That belief didn't make him loud. It didn't make him angry. It made him steady. And sometimes, steady is far more dangerous to the wrong people than rage. Because rage burns out. Steady waits. What Tony didn't know was that his former boss had picked the wrong man to punish. Not because Tony was powerful, or connected, or strategic, but because the truth around him was consistent. And when truth stays consistent long enough, it attracts witnesses. People start asking questions. Former coworkers are interviewed. Customers are contacted. Internal emails are reviewed. Policies are compared against actual outcomes. And slowly, a story the company thought it controlled begins to tell itself without them. So as you listen to what comes next, ask yourself this. Have you ever assumed silence meant defeat? Have you ever believed that someone who walks away quietly is lost? Because what Tony didn't know, sitting alone in that leaking shop, was who had already taken note of his name. The night before everything changed, the storm rolled in without warning. Rain hit the roof of the shop in uneven bursts, wind pushing it sideways so hard it rattled the loose panels above the service bays. Tony stayed later than usual, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag, double-checking invoices, doing the small end-of-day rituals that kept his mind steady. The clock on the wall read just past 9:30 p.m., and the street outside was nearly empty, washed clean by the rain. He shut down the compressor, and the sudden quiet felt heavier than normal, like the building itself was holding its breath. Tony reached for his jacket, thinking about the drive home and the leftovers waiting in his fridge when a sound cut through the storm. It wasn't thunder. It was sharper, metal twisting in a way it never should. Then tires screaming, the sound stretching too long, followed by a hollow impact that seemed to shake the windows. Tony froze, one hand still on the light switch. His heart started pounding before his mind caught up. He stepped toward the front of the shop, peering through the rain-streaked glass, but the angle was wrong. All he could see were blurred headlights and reflections rippling across the wet pavement. Somewhere just beyond his view, something had gone terribly wrong. He stood there, listening. Rain, wind, and then a faint sound underneath it all, something human, almost lost in the storm. Tony's stomach tightened. He told himself it could be nothing. A blown tire, a fender bender. But his body had already decided before his thoughts did. He grabbed his keys and moved toward the door, pausing for half a second as the memory of his wife surfaced uninvited. Laura's voice, calm and familiar, telling him to be careful, telling him not to ignore that feeling in his chest. Tony exhaled slowly, steadying himself. As he unlocked the door, his mind raced through possibilities. The intersection outside the shop was poorly lit, especially in heavy rain. He'd complained about it before. Cars came through too fast, drivers trusting green lights more than visibility. Tony stepped out under the awning, the cold air soaking into his clothes immediately. The smell of wet asphalt filled his lungs. He still hadn't seen anything clearly, just the aftermath and sound, just the suggestion of chaos somewhere close. For a brief moment, Tony hesitated, not because he didn't care, but because he understood how quickly moments like this could pull you into something you couldn't step back from. He thought about the shop, the cameras, the rules, the way everything now came with a consequence. And yet, standing there in the rain, listening to the storm swallow whatever had just happened, there was only one truth that mattered to him. Someone out there might need help. Tony didn't know it yet, but the next 5 minutes would decide his future. The cruiser came into view in fragments, not all at once. Headlights smeared across the rain, then the unmistakable outline of a police car sliding sideways, tires no longer obeying the road. It hydroplaned through the intersection like it had lost its weight, clipped the curb, and slammed hard into a steel light pole. The sound wasn't explosive. It was dull and final, the kind of impact that forces the air out of your lungs even when you're only listening. Smoke pushed out from under the hood almost immediately, thin at first, then thicker, carrying the sharp smell of burned rubber and something electrical. Sparks jumped where metal scraped against concrete. Rain hissed as it hit the hot engine, turning the whole scene into noise and confusion. Tony stood frozen under the awning, his brain struggling to organize what his eyes were seeing. Inside the cruiser, the officer didn't move. Officer Lane. Tony would learn the name later, but in that moment, it was just a person slumped forward, seatbelt locked tight, one hand pressed awkwardly against the steering wheel. The windshield was spiderwebbed, the driver's side door bent inward, pinned by the pole. The engine coughed, then stalled, leaving only the rain and the faint crackle of something overheating. Tony took a step forward and then stopped. Just one beat. In that pause, everything ran through his mind at once. The cameras on his building, the policies he'd signed, the warning emails about liability and involvement. He thought about how easily a person could do the right thing and still lose everything. His foot hovered over the curb, rain soaking through his shoes. Then he heard it, a sound barely louder than the rain, a breath that didn't come all the way in. Tony didn't rush. He didn't shout. He moved the way people do when they're afraid of making things worse. He approached the cruiser slowly, testing his footing on the slick pavement, peering inside without touching anything yet. Officer Lane's eyes were open but unfocused, panic sitting just under the surface. The smell inside the car was stronger now, plastic and heat. Tony leaned closer, his voice low, steady, telling the officer to stay still, telling him help was coming even though Tony didn't know that for sure. Rain ran down his neck, his hands trembling as he assessed what he could and couldn't do. There was no heroism in the moment, just time pressing in, consequences waiting on every choice, and a man trying to decide how much he was willing to risk for someone he'd never met. Tony didn't announce what he was doing. He moved back toward the shop, rain blurring his vision, his mind narrowing to the few things he knew for certain. The engine was still hot. The door was pinned. Time mattered. He grabbed a pry bar from just inside the bay, then hesitated, adding a thick mechanic's glove from the counter without really thinking about it. When he returned to the cruiser, the smoke was heavier, curling up into the rain like it was looking for somewhere to go. Officer Lane's head rolled slightly as he spoke to her again, keeping his voice calm, telling her to focus on breathing. She tried to answer, but the words came out broken, unfinished. Her eyes closed, then opened again. Tony wedged the pry bar into the bent edge of the door, his boots slipping as he leaned his weight into it. The metal groaned, resisting, then shifted just enough to give him hope. Heat rushed out from the engine compartment, sharp and immediate. He adjusted his grip, misjudged the angle, and felt pain flash through his hand as the metal burned through the glove. He sucked in air through his teeth, but didn't pull back. He couldn't. Officer Lane stirred, her breathing shallow, her voice barely there. "Hey," she murmured, not quite looking at him. "What's your name?" The question landed strangely, like it carried more weight than it should have. Tony paused for half a second, then shook his head. "It doesn't matter," he said quietly. "Just stay with me." The door opened enough for him to reach the seatbelt. His fingers shook as he worked it free, every movement careful, controlled, like rushing might break something that couldn't be fixed. Officer Lane drifted again, her head lolling forward, and Tony had to say her name louder this time, grounding her, reminding her she wasn't alone. When the belt finally released, he eased her toward him, bracing her weight against his shoulder. The rain soaked them both, the smell of smoke clinging to his clothes. Tony guided her away from the car, step by slow step, until they reached the sidewalk. He sat her down gently, checking her breathing, making sure she stayed upright. In the distance, sirens began to rise, faint at first, then clearer. Tony stood, his hand throbbing now that adrenaline was fading. He looked at Officer Lane one last time to be sure she was conscious, then turned back toward the shop. He didn't wait to be thanked. He didn't stay to explain. By the time the first cruiser pulled into the intersection, Tony was already inside, washing his burned hand in the sink, the sound of sirens muffled by closing doors. Tony didn't make it to work the next morning. He woke up before his alarm, his hand swollen and wrapped in a towel that had already gone damp. Every small movement sent a dull reminder up his arm. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, doing the math in his head the way he always did. Miss a shift, lose a day's pay. Miss too many, start answering questions. He called the shop anyway, voice flat, explaining that he'd been injured the night before and needed the morning. There was a pause on the other end of the line, not the kind that carries worry, but the kind that measures inconvenience. "We're short today," his boss finally said. "Figure it out by tomorrow." When Tony came in later that afternoon, the shop was already loud with impact wrenches and shouted orders. No one asked about his hand. No one asked why he was limping slightly. His boss barely looked up from the clipboard, eyes narrowing instead. "You were supposed to open," he said, irritation clear. Tony nodded once, apologized without explanation, and went straight to his bay. He worked slower than usual, hiding the pain, rewrapping his hand during breaks. He waited for someone to say something, anything. A question, a thank you, a sign that the night before had mattered at all. Nothing came. Over the next few days, the tone shifted. Small comments. Schedules changed without warning. A note in his file about reliability. Tony felt it before he understood it. The way people do when the ground starts moving under them. He still hadn't told anyone about the accident. He didn't think it was relevant. He didn't think it was his story to tell. All he knew was that something had been set in motion, and it wasn't moving in his favor. And this is where the story should have ended. But instead, it began to unravel. The firing didn't happen all at once. It arrived slowly, wrapped in routine. Tony was called into the office at the end of the day, the way he had been dozens of times before, usually to talk inventory or scheduling. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and oil, the blinds half closed against the late afternoon light. His boss didn't ask him to sit. He didn't explain why the door was shut. He just reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope, already sealed, already decided. Tony recognized it immediately, though he'd never received one before. He took it with his uninjured hand, feeling the weight of it before he even opened it. The letter was short, carefully written. Termination effective immediately. No severance. No transition period. At the bottom, a single line stood out, underlined in pen. "You cost the shop time." Tony read it twice, then once more, slower, as if a different meaning might appear if he gave it enough space. He thought about the hours he'd stayed late, the weekends he'd come in without being asked, the customers he'd kept safe. None of it was mentioned. None of it mattered. His boss cleared his throat, waiting for an argument that never came. Tony didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. He didn't bring up the storm, the cruiser, the burned hand. He didn't mention the officer whose breathing he'd kept steady while rain soaked through his jacket. He just nodded once. "Okay," he said quietly. The word surprised even him with how small it sounded. His boss looked almost disappointed, as if conflict had been expected, maybe even needed. Instead, there was only silence, stretching longer than either of them seemed comfortable with. Tony walked back to his bay and packed his tools one by one. Each sound echoed more than it should have. A wrench placed into a drawer, a rag folded and tucked away. No one stopped him. No one watched. When he finally stepped outside, the sun was already low, the parking lot half empty. He stood there for a moment, envelope in hand, breathing slowly, letting the quiet settle. Sometimes silence is the loudest part of a story. The truth about his boss didn't come out in one dramatic moment. It surfaced in fragments, through the way he spoke when he thought no one important was listening, through the way he reduced people to numbers and minutes, productivity and liability. To him, the shop wasn't a place where lives intersected, it was a machine, and anyone who slowed it down was a problem to be removed. Tony learned this not from confrontation, but from what was said after he was already gone. A former co-worker called him a week later, voice low, choosing words carefully. He said, "You got what you deserved," the co-worker admitted. Said, "You don't get paid to play hero." When the rescue was mentioned, it wasn't met with curiosity or concern. It was laughed off, a short, dismissive laugh, the kind that signals a conversation is over. If he wants to save people, the boss reportedly said, he can do it on his own time. To him, kindness was inefficiency. Compassion was a liability. The idea that someone might step outside the narrow boundaries of policy for another human being wasn't admirable. It was irresponsible. And that belief wasn't hidden. It was worn openly, reinforced in meetings, rewarded in metrics. What makes this harder to hear is how familiar it sounds. Many people watching this have worked under someone like that. Someone who sees loyalty as something owed upward, never returned downward. Someone who believes power justifies indifference. Tony didn't argue because he understood something in that moment. The decision to fire him had nothing to do with one missed shift or one unauthorized action. It was about control, about reminding everyone else what happens when you act on your conscience instead of a rule book. And if you're feeling that tightness in your chest right now, that anger that comes from knowing this happens every day, you're not wrong. The outrage you feel isn't imagined. It's the recognition of a system that punishes empathy and calls it efficiency. And the most unsettling part is this. The boss truly believed the story ended there. The weeks after the firing blurred together in a way Tony had never experienced before. Bills stacked up on the kitchen table, envelopes left unopened at first, then opened slowly, one at a time, like he was bracing for impact. The refrigerator hummed louder than usual in the quiet house, half empty most nights. His truck needed repairs he couldn't afford to finish, parts laid out neatly on the garage floor like a promise he couldn't keep yet. He picked up small jobs where he could, cash work for neighbors, fixing lawnmowers, replacing brakes, stretching every dollar until it felt thin in his hands. There was no backup plan, no savings big enough to lean on, just the hope that something would change before the numbers stopped working. At night, he sat in the dark longer than he should have, replaying the sequence of events again and again, not with anger, but with resignation. He told himself this was how stories like his ended. A good deed misunderstood. A quiet consequence. Life moving on without ceremony. He stopped checking his phone. Stopped expecting calls. He didn't talk about the accident anymore. He didn't talk about Officer Lane at all. He assumed she'd recovered and forgotten his face as easily as his boss had dismissed his name. The thought hurt more than he expected, but he accepted it as part of the cost. Tony thought no one had noticed. Officer Lane woke slowly, the sterile smell of the hospital room sharp in her nose. Machines beeped softly, marking life she hadn't fully registered yet. The rain from the night before had long stopped, but the memory of it clung to her mind. The smell of wet asphalt, the heat of the crushed metal, the sudden weight of someone's hands guiding her out of danger. Her body ached in ways she didn't yet understand, but her first thought wasn't pain, it was gratitude. She needed to know who had saved her. Who? Who helped me? She asked the nurse, voice hoarse, almost a whisper. She pictured the figure she barely remembered clearly, the man in the soaked jacket, soaked hair plastered to his forehead, hands trembling slightly, but steady enough to keep her alive. The nurse shook her head gently. "No one's come forward," she said. "We don't know who pulled you out of the car." Her words sank in differently than they intended. Officer Lane realized that the person who had risked so much hadn't stayed for thanks. He had vanished before anyone could properly acknowledge him. The thought didn't sit right with her. A hero who walked away, invisible to the system that should have recognized him. Someone who acted purely out of instinct, out of decency, and then disappeared into ordinary life. Officer Lane found herself thinking about him constantly, wondering how someone could do something so extraordinary and yet expect nothing in return. She wanted to find him, not for reward, not for applause, but because something about the way he had acted felt unexplainable in a world that always demanded recognition that it wasn't until a week later, after calls to the precinct and a quiet conversation with a co-worker who had seen the surveillance footage, that Officer Lane began to piece it together. The story that had arrived in fragments suddenly took shape in a way she hadn't expected. Tony Russo, the man who had pulled her from the wreck, whose hands had burned and body soaked through, who had guided her to safety with nothing more than quiet determination, had been fired. Fired. Not for negligence. Not for incompetence. Not for failure to follow protocol. But for missing work. For doing what no policy had ever accounted for, saving a life. The injustice hit her like a physical blow. She replayed the night in her mind. The way the rain had pounded. The way the metal had groaned. The way a single, steady human hand had kept her alive. And now to know that those very hands had been punished, humiliated, dismissed, stripped of livelihood, felt unbearable. Every detail she had taken for granted suddenly carried weight. The limp he had hidden, the burned hand he had washed in silence, the way he hadn't waited for thanks. He had vanished into the shadows of the world he had saved, only to be condemned by the people who should have recognized him. Everything changed here. In that moment, Officer Lane's quiet recovery became a catalyst. She understood something that the company never would. That decency could be invisible, yet undeniable. That sometimes the real consequences of courage aren't immediate, and sometimes the world's measure of a person fails entirely. The man who should have been celebrated was now at the center of a story no one expected to hear. Officer Lane sat up straighter in her hospital bed, the force still attached to her arm, thinking carefully. She didn't post anything online. She didn't tag the local news or send pictures to social media. She didn't want the attention or the applause. This wasn't about headlines. It was about correcting a wrong, quietly, effectively, where it mattered. She picked up the phone instead and dialed her captain, her voice calm but firm, recounting what she knew. The night of the storm, the car, the details that could only have come from someone on the scene, the fact that the man who saved her had vanished and was now reportedly fired. She gave names, dates, and descriptions, each word measured, each pause intentional. Her captain listened, asking questions, clarifying, documenting. By the end of the call, it was clear. Someone at the top needed to know, and it was going to reach beyond the precinct. Officer Lane hung up, leaning back, letting the gravity of what she had just done settle in. No posts, no public spectacle, just a single decision to use the right channels, the ones that could actually make a difference. And that's when the phone call started. Tony was at home, sitting at the edge of his kitchen table, staring at the bills he had stacked neatly earlier in the day. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles heavy in the chest, broken only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the wall clock. Then, faint at first, came the sound of engines. Low, distant, almost indistinct. Tony frowned, trying to place them, telling himself it was probably just a car passing by on the wet street. But the sound didn't fade. Instead, it grew, steady, deliberate. A single patrol car slowed in front of his house, lights flashing briefly through the blinds. Tony's stomach clenched. He didn't move at first, listening, unsure whether to step outside or wait. Then a second car arrived, followed by a third. Each one a quiet punctuation, a signal he couldn't ignore. The hum of tires on wet asphalt was now accompanied by the rising pitch of sirens cutting through the afternoon calm. Tony rose slowly, the envelope from his firing still on the table, unopened. The quiet of the house gave way to a pattern of sound he couldn't escape. 10 vehicles now, circling, stopping, their lights reflecting in the windows. The street outside had become a corridor of blue and red, flashing against rain-slicked pavement. He didn't know if it was for him, or what had triggered it, but he felt the weight of attention pressing against the walls, seeping through the door. And as he stood there, chest tightening, he realized this moment was unlike any other he had faced. This wasn't routine. This wasn't an ordinary day. Something had shifted, and there was no turning back. That Tony's first thought as the sirens grew louder was that he had done something wrong. Every lesson drilled into him over the years, the rules, the policies, The careful way he'd kept his head down flashed through his mind. His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in weeks, the quiet house felt suffocating. Had someone called the police about the shop? About the unpaid invoices? Had a customer finally complained about that small adjustment he'd made months ago? His hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitating. The fear was physical, a tight coil in his stomach that refused to loosen. Every instinct told him to hide, to pretend he wasn't home, to let this pass without interaction. But the sound of boots on wet pavement, the muffled voices through closed doors, drew him forward. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped toward the front door. Rain dripped from the eaves, splashing against the porch, the drops steady, unrelenting. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for what he assumed would be confrontation, for someone to tell him he'd crossed a line he didn't even see. Tony turned the knob. The door swung open just enough to reveal the first officer, flashlight in hand, eyes scanning him carefully. The engine of a nearby car idled, its red and blue lights reflecting across the wet driveway. Tony's chest tightened again. His mouth opened, but no words came at first. The fear that had rooted him to the spot minutes before surged again, yet a quiet determination pushed him forward. Even as he prepared for whatever judgment he assumed was coming, that Tony's chest tightened again, but this time with a different kind of tension. Outside, the patrol cars had formed a semicircle around his driveway, engines idling, lights casting reflections across the wet asphalt. One by one, uniformed officers stepped forward, boots crunching lightly against gravel. Tony felt the weight of their gaze, not accusatory this time, but expectant, like the world had paused for this one moment. He didn't move at first, unsure what he was supposed to do, until a familiar voice cut through the hum of engines and rainfall. Officer Lane stepped forward, her uniform damp, hair still flattened from the storm she had survived, eyes locking with his. She didn't hesitate. She didn't mumble. She spoke loud enough for neighbors to hear, loud enough for every passerby to understand. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet street. The words weren't just a courtesy. They were recognition of the risk, of the pain, of the courage no policy could ever measure. Tony's shoulders slumped as the weight of everything he had endured shifted slightly, finally easing. The line of officers behind her stood at attention, some nodding quietly, others murmuring their acknowledgement, and for the first time in weeks, Tony felt seen. Not for the work he had done in the shop, not for the hours he had kept, not for the policies he had followed. This was recognition for doing what was right when no one expected it. The neighborhood, alerted by the sirens and the voices, paused to watch. And in that moment, the quiet heroism, the long weeks of being overlooked, the silence that had followed him home, all of it finally mattered. News travels in ways no one expects. By the next morning, word of Tony's rescue, and the circumstances of his firing, had reached the ears of his former boss. The man who had dismissed kindness as inefficiency suddenly found himself facing something he couldn't control. The story didn't explode with chaos. It spread quietly, steadily, through the customers who had trusted Russo Auto for years. They asked questions. They demanded explanations. They noticed the absence of the man who had once treated every car and every person like it mattered. Slowly, the shop's reputation began to erode. Loyal customers walked in, only to leave, their trust shaken. A few went directly to competitors, recounting the story with a mix of disbelief and admiration for Tony. The management tried to maintain normalcy, but the weight of public scrutiny settled in like rain on metal, persistent, unavoidable. Accountability arrived not with shouting or scandal, but through the subtle, unyielding pressure of attention. Every policy, every decision, every dismissal was examined under a light that the company could no longer ignore. Tony wasn't the one making the calls, writing the posts, or demanding retribution. Yet the consequences of his quiet heroism rippled outward, reshaping the world he had stepped into, long after he had walked away from the office. And those who had once held power without reflection suddenly found that action, even small and unintended, carries weight that cannot be erased. Justice didn't come with fanfare. It didn't arrive in headlines or grand proclamations. It arrived quietly, carried in the measured steps of those who had witnessed the truth and refused to let it be ignored. It arrived with badges, with the acknowledgement of Officer Lane and the officers who had lined up on that rain-slicked driveway, with the subtle but undeniable shift in the community that had once watched in silence. The world didn't need to erupt to recognize what was right. It simply remembered. And memory proved to be the most enduring form of accountability. People remembered the man who had risked himself without hesitation. They remembered the courage that went unnoticed in the moment but became impossible to ignore over time. Even his former boss could feel the weight of it, not through confrontation, not through punishment, but through the quiet erosion of the world's trust. Integrity had a way of outlasting indifference, and kindness carried consequences that no policy could anticipate. In the end, the balance wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, deliberate, and deeply human. Justice didn't need to shout. It simply arrived, in full measure, carried on the memory of a night when one man's quiet courage reminded everyone around him what it meant to do the right thing. Tony never asked to be a hero. He didn't seek recognition or praise. He didn't weigh the risks in a spreadsheet or calculate what he might gain or lose. He simply refused to walk away when someone needed help. That choice, quiet and uncompromising, set into motion a chain of events that changed lives, not just his own, but those around him. It was a reminder that courage isn't always loud, and that doing the right thing often comes with unseen consequences. Think about it for a moment. Do you believe Tony did the right thing, even knowing what it cost him? Could you have acted the same way if you were standing in his shoes, watching someone's life hang in the balance while the rules and policies closed in around you? If this story meant something to you, if it stirred even a small part of your sense of justice or humanity, take a moment to like and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered, and the quiet acts of bravery behind them deserve to be seen.